Deep conversations with the right people are priceless, and ideas are formed in the crucible of authentic, connected, and sometimes controversial conversations. No ideas are off the table because why would they be? Join us on Inquisitive Souls as we lead with curiosity, empathy, and a massive heaping of juvenile humor. Join us on this learning journey. All right, before we saddle up, I want to tell you about the Dad Edge Alliance, which is my absolute favorite community on the whole entire internet. It's a group of, at the time of my recording, it's about 250 guys. It's growing all the time, but it is a community unlike anything I've ever seen. And I don't know if you could hear that thunder that just happened, but that is a sign that what I'm saying is truly, truly important. That's right. Thunder. Thunder happened when I'm talking about the Dad Edge Alliance. So listen, if you're a guy and you are feeling like your friendships or your relationships are superficial, you get around, you shoot the shit, but you're never going deeper. You don't feel safe to do that. And you know that there's something more. I'm telling you, join this community. It is insanely life-changing. Okay. Like we got guys in there from all walks of life. But they all have one thing in common. They're trying to elevate fatherhood by improving themselves. They're leaning in. They're supporting each other. They're learning from one another. They're learning about themselves. They're challenging themselves. They're setting goals. They're holding each other accountable. But they are all doing it in a place that's totally safe and totally just overflowing with bro love. And I'm trying to say that in a manly way. Bro love, right? So, one of the things that I've learned throughout my own personal development journey, which is a journey that will last the rest of my life, obviously, is that the people you surround yourself with that's one of the most important choices you can make. Many of you have probably heard the quote, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And when I first heard that, logically, I got it. Okay, that makes sense. But I never could have imagined what it actually meant. How transformative it is to get a better, higher caliber, more open, loving, caring, relentless group of men in your life. So that's what this fucking community provides. I mean, I don't know how to state it in a way that really truly conveys how I feel about it. Maybe I'll just say fuck a lot more. But I mean, the stuff that goes on here is crazy. They've got community calls. They've got accountability teams. They've got amazing content, free books. We're building courses. We have experts come in, New York Times bestselling authors, Navy SEALs to speak to the guys. And the guys are learning and they're growing and they're building relationships with one another and they're bringing a better version of themselves into every aspect of their life. So please think about it. Look around you. Do you have the group of people around you that are going to help you create the fucking life you want? Most people don't. Most people don't even know there's an alternative. And most people don't even understand how important it is. So I'm telling you from my own personal experience and witnessing hundreds of people have the same experience, it changes everything. Okay, so listen, if you want to know more, you can either always send me a message or you can go to gooddadproject.com/alliance and I'll put that link in the show notes page. Do it. And it will help you become emotionally fucking excellent. Now on to the show. My conversation today is with Dr. Traci Stein, and she's a Columbia-trained licensed clinical psychologist and health educator. She's also certified in clinical hypnosis by the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, and she helps people reduce uncomfortable physical and emotional symptoms and gain greater insight into who they are and want to be. And I got to tell you, I loved this conversation. Talking to Traci is one of those opportunities that I relish, which is to talk to somebody who's vastly more educated and knowledgeable than myself. And I felt like I really learned a lot. It was really quite a wide-ranging discussion, actually. I had these really interesting preconceived notions about hypnosis. Or I shouldn't say that. I'm not sure that I had preconceived notions about hypnosis. I really didn't know very much about it at all, other than the fact that it had some therapeutic applications and, comedians or performers also do it to people to hilarious effect on stage. So it was a really awesome opportunity for me to learn more about this. And she coined a term in there somewhere in the conversation, which is, I'm going to title the episode, which is emotional Tai Chi, which I thought was great. And, but we talked about hypnosis. We talked about, kind of how we create our worlds. We talked about even propaganda and kind of how that works, which is an interesting part of the conversation. So I want to say thank you to Traci for coming on the show and having a wonderful conversation with me and helping me walk out of it more knowledgeable than I was when I walked into it. And that's really the benefit of having conversations like this. I think it was David Cooper, the founder of Appreciative Inquiry, who said, "We live in the worlds that our conversations create." And that's a really, really important concept. So the world that this conversation with Traci helped me create was one with a deeper understanding, more knowledge, more compassion. And I don't know, I feel like I moved the needle a little bit forward. Towards what? Fuck, I have no idea. But I felt like the needle was moving. So thanks to you, Traci, for coming on the show. And thank you for all the work that you've done to help people improve their lives. You're making a huge contribution, and I really, really valued the chance for us to talk. Enjoy the show, everybody, and get ready for some emotional Tai Chi with Dr. Traci Stein. Traci, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's funny. I've become so fascinated with the field of psychology because just to make a confession, I was one of those people that for the longest time believed that, when people went to school for psychology, it was basically for the purpose of not being able to get an actual job when they were done. That was my own, my own ignorance, obviously. But as I've grown up and, evolved as a human being, it's just so fascinating to me. And I find the older I get, the more and more I wish I had gone back and taken that path, because I realize there's just so much to know about the human mind and how we operate in the world.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting field. And, I've certainly learned a lot and I'm still learning. And I hope that's a lifelong process that continues.
One thing that I am actually interested in, maybe before we start, I'd love your opinion on it. But, I realize for myself that there's all these ways that I hold myself back. And sometimes I'm not sure what to do with them. Like, we have these narratives running in our head, and I'm sure we'll get into all that kind of stuff. But from your perspective, what is the difference between, or what is the different roles, say a coach versus a therapist? How do you see the differences between those two?
That's such a good question. And I haven't really thought about it too formally before this moment. But I think therapists are formally trained not to give advice. But in practice, I think we do guide people and we try and help them be more aware of what's in line with their kind of highest good or their highest desires for themselves, their healthiest desires. And so we teach them skills and give them techniques to kind of help them get there and address the things that maybe aren't going so well. I think coaching is probably more directive, and certainly there's training, there's different probably amounts of time and different degrees of formality and different regulations separating the two fields. You may know more about the coaching aspect. But I think basically it's people coming together for the purposes of helping one of them. And I think that's a good thing.
Okay, wonderful. So one thing that I am really interested in, and I only have a maybe slightly more than superficial understanding of it at this point, but is the idea of how subjective our experience of reality, quote, reality really is. And I think that's a concept that most people have a hard time wrapping their head around, because I see it, I feel it, it's real. And so when I guess, what are your thoughts on? I'd just be interested in hearing your opinion on as human beings in general. How it is that we construct this subjective interpretation of our experience.
That's such a great question. And you're the first person to actually ask me that. So I know this is going to be a really stimulating interview. Um, we all have our own lenses for looking at ourselves and looking at the world. And my take on that is, as somebody who's certified in clinical hypnosis, I think about that um, through a hypnotic framework very often because our lenses may or may not be accurate. And there are a variety of things that we may be conscious of and also not quite so conscious of that shape our worldview or these lenses. And, sometimes it's okay if a lens isn't exactly accurate. So, for example, I might think that I'm a better athlete than I actually am. But if it motivates me to be more physically active and compete in sports and do things that enhance my life, that's good. And it's going to contribute to my having a pretty healthy sense of self, a good self esteem. But if the flip side of that might be that no matter what I do, my kind of subjective lens will tell me that it's not good enough or that I'm not deserving of good things or healthy relationships or things like that. Those kinds of lenses I would refer to as, again, as a hypnotherapist, I would say those are kind of trance lenses. And the problem with that is that the movie in our mind can be so persuasive that we will discount the evidence that contradicts it, sometimes to our own detriment. So you see people getting involved in these patterns that are really unhealthy for them, but there's something in the background. There's kind of this personal billboard that tells them that they have to keep doing things this way. So when I think about reality and subjective reality versus objective, I'm usually thinking about how does this affect this person's well-being.
Okay, I see. So, yeah, I mean, what I've been learning about is that our brains are like really prediction machines. So we use our past experiences, for example, to help us, predict what we think is going to happen or how we feel like we should react to a feeling in our body, for example. And a lot of times those are, depending on our past experiences, are not necessarily relevant or don't serve us in, the current moment that we're experiencing.
Definitely. It's the good thing that we learn, right? We want to not keep repeating the same errors again and again. We want to gain skills and hone those skills based on learning things in our past. But many people, their past experiences have been very traumatic or emotionally distressing, or they may have learned via some other important person that, something about themselves that, again, may not be true or may not be helpful. And unfortunately, those kind of learned experiences can shape how we do things going forward. And this could be at work or with our health behaviors or our relationships in general, or how well we can love ourselves. And so it's really important to take a look at the things that we have learned periodically and examine, is this true? How do I know? And does this serve me? So that's kind of how I think about that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's funny. I have this friend. I think. Tell me if in your experience, if this is a common thing, because I have a friend of mine who is one of these people who, I mean, ultimately at the core of what I see as the issue is he's got a very low sense of self-worth. And so what he constantly does is he acts out in the world, as a guy who has a very, low sense of self-worth. So, he's needy and, he makes irrational decisions. I shouldn't say they're irrational. They make sense to him, but he makes decisions based on his emotions and, especially if he gets involved in a relationship. And what ends up happening is he looks at the outcomes that he's getting and he can't connect the dots back to the root cause, so he's just like, oh God, another thing I didn't turn out the way I want. Oh God, another thing I didn't turn out the way I want. But he's just looking at the things, the outcomes, and saying basically, I'm cursed. I can't. This is just bad luck that happens to me over and over again. Is that so? I guess what I'm asking is, I mean, or the way I think about it is, I mean, he's obviously creating this situation for himself over and over again, but he's just got such a hard time seeing that and acknowledging it. That and is that a common thing in your experience that people need to? I mean, that you help people sort of unpack.
Many people will even come in to see me for other reasons, such as chronic pain or stress reduction or trying to figure out which job they want to pick and a host of other things. But it will invariably become apparent what kind of relationships they tend to have. And you do see people who become very fatalistic, like, well, things just don't work out for me. Or if they're dating, they'll be on the fifth person or the 10th person who doesn't get back to them reliably or really isn't ready for a healthy relationship or does the some version of the same thing that on paper might look different at first. And what they'll say is, oh, this just means there are no good, men or women out there. Or, this is just my luck, or I'm never going to be happy. And it's really important to help somebody step back from the situation and kind of look at, what are the things that tend to lead up to this? And what are the types of thoughts and feelings they tend to have as they go about their daily lives and that precipitate various choices that they make. And often you can, if you can work with somebody and help them kind of step back and look at this more objectively, they can become more aware of, again, these kind of dysfunctional or inaccurate or unhelpful beliefs that drive these patterns. But it's really hard because we tend to cling to the explanations that make the most sense to us. And sometimes that also take the responsibility and place it elsewhere. So it can be really challenging. So somebody has to be in a place of readiness and also have some tools to manage the stress that comes with looking at stuff that's uncomfortable.
Readiness is a really interesting concept to me because I think logically everybody knows that, if, like, I'll give you another example from my personal life. Like, we had my wife's sister down. She's a wonderful human being, but I would say she's probably not the most effective parent. And but it's interesting because she's not ready. Like, she's just not there. She can't receive any type of advice because for whatever, it doesn't really matter, whatever the reason is. And, I guess you hear people say, well, and I said it about her, like, she's just not ready to hear any advice from anybody else because she's going to take it as an indictment of, her parenting. She already feels, like she's struggling and all that kind of stuff. And so I sometimes wonder when you say, well, somebody's not ready, uh, I feel like that absolves, say, me, and maybe I'm just giving myself way too much, importance in my own mind here. But, like, is there anything that we can do as people who care about other people to facilitate them or act as a catalyst for them becoming ready? Or is it purely an internal thing to the person, to the maybe the other person in question, if you know what I mean?
So I'm going to say yes and no. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. So the yes part about what you can do, you can be mindful of the fact that somebody has a hard time hearing feedback and really protective of their sense of self and can feel really threatened by anything that's not positive, even though another part of them is asking you for help in one way or and another way to get at that might be to ask them how they would like things to be different and what they would be willing to do differently. And what are some of the things that would feel frightening about doing that, whether it's fear of failure or fear that people would criticize them, and just agree to be supportive through that process and encourage people to get professional help if that's needed. But that said, we can't do the work for anybody else. And I think that's actually one of the hardest lessons for therapists to learn, as well as your average person. Because when we care about somebody, whether that's a patient or a friend or a family member, and we see how their lives could be better or how they're making it worse, we really do want to help. But some people are just not in a place of readiness. And it's, that saying the devil you know versus the devil you don't. Like, people will choose sometimes to stay with something that isn't really working well because a part of them feels that they need to keep doing it that way. And a lot of people's self-esteem is fragile because either they were raised by people who were hypercritical, so they're really defended against criticism, or conversely, all they got was super laudatory feedback. You don't have to do things differently. You're so wonderful. You're the best kid ever. And either way, you can wind up with somebody who can't take in any feedback that isn't positive. And it's really, really hard to work with people like that because they usually don't want to change, even if there's some other problem that kind of requires that they do change. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I think one of the, something I'm learning about right now too, and starting to practice is the motivational interviewing. And one of the things they talk about is this concept of ambivalence, which I think is so interesting because, you can hold two contradictory points of view over the same thing. I want to lose weight, but I, you know, I feel stressed, and eating is a coping mechanism to help me deal with my stress, for example, or, and I think what people do, this is why I was asking you how to help, because I see that what often happens with people, and I've done this a million times myself. I try not to do it anymore though, is when somebody's ambivalent around a specific change they want to make, when you try to push them in a specific direction, it's like they automatically default to the other side of the other perspective that they have going inside their own mind. And you can actually create more sort of sustained talk than actually helping guide them towards change talk. I'm not sure what the phenomenon behind that is, about why, people might generally just want to take the opposite point of view when they're ambivalent on an issue.
Well, what I tell my students, I supervise some doctoral students, and I'm teaching other students. But one thing I'll tell them sometimes is, like, imagine there's something you've been holding on to, whether you have conflicted feelings about it or not. You've held on to it for a long time. And imagine someone coming and trying to take it away from you, like take it out of your hands. The natural reaction for most people is to cling more tightly. And so what I'll say is, when you're dealing with an issue like that with somebody, use Tai Chi, not boxing. So instead of coming at somebody really forcefully, which they're either going to kind of punch back or run away, be a little more, not indirect, but kind of meet them and change how you move. And it doesn't need to be, and it shouldn't be so forceful. It should be collaborative. It should be more like dancing than boxing, and see what happens. And a lot of times that frees something up for someone to make a choice and move a little closer to one side or another. Not always. But the example you brought up about weight loss, I think, is so relevant when you're talking about ambivalence and readiness to change and being stuck in patterns. I've worked with a lot of people who were very overweight, some of them more than 100 pounds overweight. And with overeating or compulsive eating, I tell people that, like many other health behaviors that aren't great for them objectively, it's like a tool. And we choose the tools we use, usually very early on, and for what a part of us feels are good reasons. And as long as a part of you feels that that good reason still applies, and you don't feel that you have other tools that you feel as comfortable with or will work better, it's going to be very hard for you to let go of that tool. So overeating is one of those things that can be a very multi-purpose tool. So it can be a mood management tool, right? You feel overwhelmed, you eat, and it's very comforting. You shove down those feelings quite literally. It's pleasurable. It stimulates, these various reward areas of the brain. It also can be a way of indirectly rebelling. So if there's a partner or a family member who is always on someone about their weight, forgive me, but it's kind of like giving the finger to that person, but without having to own it. If a part of you maintains that weight. So there are a lot of functions that one tool can serve that even the person may not be consciously aware of. And again, until they're ready to let go or feel there's a better tool for them, it can be very difficult to help them shift their behavior, even if a part of them says, no, I really have to make this change.
I experienced that same thing with really with drinking, which I'm sure is pretty common. And I didn't. For me, I think it was related to the pain I experienced, through my wife's illness and death, and my own inability to understand my emotions. But um, when I would try to stop because I didn't have any other tools, as you're saying, I mean, it was almost physically painful. And I mean, it wasn't physically painful because I had the DTs or anything like that. But I mean, it was like I could feel like it would trigger this sensation of so much discomfort in my body that and my mind, obviously, that it was like an itch I could not scratch. And well, I feel like what I realize now is that, I was obviously coping in at some way with the pain I had gone through, because when I finally managed to stop drinking, I started experiencing all of these emotions. I was just in a better space to be able to, understand that this was part of the journey. And when you don't numb yourself out, you're going to experience things you wouldn't have otherwise. And I really think what you're saying is it really connects with me, because I didn't know how to handle the 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 human experience of not numbing myself, and it was I think that's what led me to just not wanting to quit, because what I would do is I would convince myself that because this is how it was going to be if I was sober, as crazy as it sounds. I mean, the alternative to me at the time seemed like it was actually just simpler to keep drinking, because as much as I didn't like it, it was less painful.
I mean, that makes complete sense. And what you're describing is certainly not exclusive to you. I mean, I'm sure you've heard many people say nearly that exact same thing. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when something is really painful or aversive to us, it's very natural for us to move away and move towards something that gets rid of it quickly. And, as a society, I think, especially in the US, I'm sure it's not exclusive to us, but we aren't really raised to learn how to sit with discomfort. And we aren't really raised to learn that we can be with discomfort and breathe through it and observe it without having to do anything about it in that moment. Either pull it very close and hold tightly to it, or succumb to it, or push it away. And I think men especially have less room. I think that's changing, thankfully, but we've historically socialized them to not be able to talk about what's painful, or for their relationships to be such that it's hard to expose themselves as vulnerable. And so, again, I think that's changing, and I think that's great. And I think it's wonderful the work you're doing, because you're really facilitating that for people on a large scale. Something like mindfulness, people talk about mindfulness probably to the point that people are almost thinking it's trendy, or they're tired of hearing about it. But really, it helps people adopt that space of healthy detachment and the ability to sit with, to observe without judging. And I think that helps people move through painful situations much better than most of the other tools we naturally
Oh,
gravitate
I
towards.
agree. I mean, when I think once you accept, like for me, anyways, once I accepted the premise that our emotions are sort of what make us human, or our constituent of our constituent parts of our humanity, or whatever. I mean, I just stopped labeling them, or tried to. I don't Not always successful. I think that'll be a lifetime journey, but try to stop labeling them as good or bad, and just experience them. And while it can be mighty uncomfortable, it's so important. Like I have this, this is a totally first world story about my emotions, but I was leaving a yoga class, and I had to come back, and I had to help my wife with something. So I needed to leave the class right at the last, like right on time. And so the class went a few minutes long. So I left, before the class was over. And as I was coming out of the bathroom, the class had ended, and the instructor goes, in the most gentle yoga voice possible, goes, um, it's really disruptive when you leave before the final namaste. And I was like, in my mind, like the thought that popped into my mind was like not fit for human consumption, but basically like, F you. If you would just finish your class on time, I wouldn't be in this awkward situation with you right now. And of course, I didn't say that, but that bothered me for hours afterwards. And I'm like, I'm sitting here going, why is this bothering me so much? Like, and what I realized, I think what it ended up being was that I wasn't happy that that thought popped into my head. It wasn't anything to do with the yoga instructor specifically, but in the past, I would have been so uncomfortable with that feeling that what I would have done I would have blamed the yoga instructor for causing it in the first place and directed my, disdain or whatever towards her and robbed myself of any chance of actually understanding what was actually going on under the surface. But you got to sit with like in this case, this minor thing, it had to sit with feeling crappy for a couple hours, which wasn't really that pleasant.
It totally makes sense though, but it's so to your credit that you were willing to take a look at it and say, well, what's going on here? And it's funny because I'm now one person further removed, so I'm imagining this scenario as you talk about it. And my other thought was, this was a case where both of your egos may have been um, overly invested in that exchange. The yoga instructor kind of chastised you, but didn't own that he or she went over. And sometimes people have to leave, and it might be for reasons unknown to the instructor, right? So, unless you're somebody who chronically leaves before and is disruptive, it's kind of it's interesting to me that that was the feedback you got, that made a point of saying that to you. But what you're saying about your ego being involved, I'm using the term ego being involved, but yeah, it can feel really shaming and criticizing when somebody gives us feedback and we feel like they don't understand where we're coming from. And if we're vulnerable to that feeling, or that feeling is something we want to push away, in trying to shove it farther away, we wind up gripping tightly to it. It's like if I said to you, for the next 30 seconds, you can think about anything in the universe but a pink elephant. Do not think about a pink elephant. Go. It would be really impossible for you to not have that pink elephant, at least in the background. We're not good at getting rid of thoughts, but we try to do it all the time. So I think it's great that you were able to look at that and understand it, and it
Yeah,
helped you
I think it
release it.
was certainly more productive than the approach I might have taken in the past. That's for sure. So let's talk about hypnosis. I have very little understanding of it. So maybe we can start at the beginning and you can talk about what it actually is.
So hypnosis is something actually that is very misunderstood. There's a lot of myths that are prevalent about hypnosis. So one of the myths is that it's sleep. It can certainly feel like sleep for people who go very deeply, but it isn't. It's a qualitatively different state. It's not something that only weak-minded people can experience. People's brains work differently, and if you're highly suggestible, your brain is better able at tuning out the stuff that's irrelevant and focusing on what you want to focus on when you're under hypnosis, and that's a good thing. Um, so, there's a lot of stuff in the movies about people automatically falling into a stupor. It's not that either. Hypnosis, what it is a state of enhanced absorption in something specific and attention to that thing, and um, enhanced receptivity to hypnotic suggestion, and decreased attention to everything else. So, for example, if somebody, let's just say you stubbed your toe and it was very painful, but the tip of your nose or the lobe of your ear was very comfortable. Well, when you're focused on the pain, you can kind of block out everything else. But if we were to direct you to get into a very relaxed and very receptive state and imagine or sense in whatever way made sense to you the feeling of neutrality or comfort in the tip of your nose or the lobe of your ear, and then imagine that comfort spreading to all other parts of you and somehow changing the sensation in your foot or even just putting it farther into the distance, that would be a hypnotic state. That would be a really good practical use of hypnosis. your attention would be on the suggestion that we want you to focus on and less on everything else, including the noise of traffic outside or your to-do list. All those things could be put off for the time being.
So that's interesting. I mean, that sounds like sort of the objective people are striving towards when they're meditating, for example. Are there similarities there?
Um, so I'm not sure. Tell me tell me a little bit more about what you're asking.
So I guess when I think of how meditation, I mean, I think of, so for example, trying to bring your attention, onto a specific thing, say, for example, like your breath, and not tuning everything out. I know we shouldn't judge our own meditation, but I'm going to. I'm terrible at this. So, uh, but so I mean that's how I think of it. So I guess when I'm hearing you say, it's really directing your attention towards a specific thing. Uh, I guess are there similarities in that way? But I'm not really. And I'm sure there are huge differences between them too. But I guess that's what I was asking.
There are similarities, and that's an excellent question. Um, and actually, mindfulness pairs extremely well with hypnosis. Maybe the difference would be that when you're practicing mindfulness, you'll still notice the other things coming into your awareness,
Mm-hmm.
but you'll be able to notice them without attaching to them and move your attention once again back to the object of your awareness. So your breathing, for example. And in hypnosis, you might find you don't even notice the other
Mm-hmm.
thing. Either they'll feel really quiet or in the background. You might not notice them at all. So, so the level of absorption in whatever stimulus it is you're focusing on, or whatever inner experience you're focusing on, I think the level of absorption is greater, and the level of kind of letting go of everything else is also greater. Um, the rumination people tend to have is very decreased with both hypnosis and mindfulness, and that's a good thing. Um, the degree of suffering can be greatly reduced, and that's why they pair really well together.
So what would be some scenarios where hypnosis might be, I don't know, like really suitable for, and what might be some, I guess, are there some scenarios where it's not? Or I guess I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this question, but there's obviously cases when they work together. At some points, there's other cases where maybe when mindfulness is maybe more applicable or makes more sense, and the same thing with hypnosis. Like, what are some of those, I guess, different scenarios where one might be more applicable than the other? To what kind of things can they help with?
So, mindfulness is good for so many things: medical symptoms, pain, nausea, anxiety, depression. And so a lot of the things that mindfulness is helpful for, hypnosis also could be helpful for. Even things like changing a habit, like quitting smoking or changing your eating habits, or um, calming the feeling of itch, which is one of those things that sounds benign, but it is so distracting. Hypnosis, I mean, there are so many things hypnosis is great for. Again, the things I just mentioned. I would say if somebody has poor reality testing, I wouldn't do hypnosis with them. If they are actively abusing a substance, I wouldn't do hypnosis with them. And there's like 10 to 15% of the population that probably can't really benefit much, if at all, from hypnosis. They're considered low hypnotizables. So in that case, you probably want to do something else with them, like mindfulness or maybe guided imagery or cognitive behavioral therapy. The rule of thumb is that if somebody's psychotic, you wouldn't do hypnosis with them. Although when I was a fellow, I was actually called to see two psychotic patients on an inpatient unit, and they, people who are psychotic in a way are in a type of trance state all the time anyway, because the movie in their minds is much more vivid and convincing than objective reality. And so it's very hard to pull somebody out of that kind of mental state. But because these people were also having chronic pain, I was able to just kind of, it's going to be hard to explain, but work with the fact that they were very trancy and help them imagine and visualize enhanced feelings of comfort and well-being and safety. And they actually did really well. So um, there are some exceptions. I think people do better with hypnosis too if they're open to it. So people who are really wedded to their kind of skepticism, or feel like they have this fear of losing control. You don't lose control when you're in hypnosis. Really, you are the person driving the ship. Especially if you're seeing a qualified provider and not some like stage hypnotist or somebody who's doing this because they took a weekend training. If you're in good hands and you can feel comfortable, hypnosis can be really wonderful. But mindfulness, I think, is good for everybody. I wouldn't even say I can imagine a situation where someone wouldn't benefit from mindfulness.
Okay, thanks. That's a great explanation. So when I think of just, so if I look at myself, for example, I think, I had this experience where my wife got sick and died. I know it caused me, like, it was a very painful experience for me. Obviously, I cope with it by again, with alcohol and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder, I really feel like I've done a lot of healing and grieving, and reconciled a lot of the thoughts in my head that needed to be sorted out and all that kind of stuff. But there's sometimes I wonder how that experience is impacting me now, and if there's ways, are there ways in which it's, the way I'm interpreting that experience is not serving me, for example. And I really have no idea how to go about figuring that out other than maybe talking to somebody. But would would hypnosis be helpful in helping me, you know as part of the process of helping me figure that out, for example?
So I can imagine hypnosis being helpful in helping guide you to feel safe and comfortable, and again, maybe adopt this sense of healthy, secure detachment as you take a look at what's working well and what is working less well for you. And that would be the best clue about whether there's something you want to address. Now, if your mood tends to be pretty good and your relationships are pretty good, and you've been able to do some healing and make meaning out of a really incredibly traumatic situation, then you may not need to do anything. We don't all have the same things, but we all have things that are difficult and are painful. We all experience loss. We all experience struggle. So, I mean, it's part of the human condition. You may or may not need to do anything else with that. But if there are feelings of unresolved guilt, or sometimes when somebody dies, especially if it's sudden or unexpected, we have all of these ideas about how we wish we had done something different, or we wish we had the opportunity to say something to this person. And because in the mind all things are possible, hypnosis can help create the conditions where we can create some sort of closure and release things that we may have been carrying around that we no longer need to carry around. And hypnosis and guided imagery aren't the same thing, but this might be a good time to bring it up. A lot of hypnosis does use guided imagery, and guided imagery really creates this inner journey. And it's one that you can shape in the way that feels most helpful to you. And I think it can be helpful with grief. I think it can be helpful with loss. Because it helps us make our narrative clearer and maybe change it. So, but you would know by the way you tend to feel, and the thoughts and feelings you tend to have when you think about your wife's illness and death, and your own place in her journey, and her place in your journey. You would have a sense of whether there's something that still needs to be resolved.
Okay. That makes sense. So what I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm summarizing this right, but if somebody has had if they need to, hypnosis can be helpful if somebody needs to examine a very emotionally charged situation or memory or experience, because it allows them to create a sense of detachment where they can maybe analyze it in a place that's more psychologically safe. Is that a good way of summarizing it?
It can, and again, because this is the movie in your mind that you're creating or you're shaping or you're changing in some way. So, you know, we could really bring in any elements that would feel helpful to you. So if you had a beloved family member, even if they've passed away, but you would say, oh, Uncle so and so is always a loving presence, and I always felt safe and secure with him, or he would know what to do in this situation. Just I'm making this up, but you could actually imagine that you're in some beautiful natural setting with Uncle so and so, or could even be a figure from literature or popular culture, anybody you think would be strong and wise and helpful to you. And together you could look at this scenario from a feeling of incredible safety. You could imagine the two of you watching it, watching a scene unfold on a movie screen, and having more and more insight than you've ever had about what the best way is for you to process this information so that you can move forward, so in the way that's most healing for you. And so the language of hypnosis, in addition to the imagery, is really important because your unconscious responds very much to symbol and imagery and metaphor and the word choice you use. So you'll notice that I'm using language that's very
Mm-hmm.
affirming. It's very that can induce a feeling of comfort and optimism. And your conscious mind takes those kinds of cues in all the time, but your unconscious does as well. And so you can use those different mental devices in hypnosis to help facilitate healing.
Is the person who is being hypnotized, like, are they talking? Are they communicative during this experience?
Sure, they can be. Um, and thank you for bringing that up, because another misconception is that hypnosis means that when you're in trance, you're completely checked out or unable to respond. And there is a subgroup of people who will go very, very deep, and it will feel like sleep until they come out, and they may not respond. But you can give people the suggestion that they can respond and they can move around as they need to, and they can respond verbally or by nodding their head or raising their hand. It really doesn't matter. But hypnotic trances can be something that feels very light, like a daydream. So again, the focus is more on somebody's inner world than the outer world at that time, but they still are able to do whatever they need to do. And as the therapist, you can give them specific and explicit suggestions to that effect.
So, and what is there? Like, you've mentioned the word trance a couple times. And is there like a sort of clinical definition of what that means?
So when we talk about this state of enhanced inner focus and absorption in something and attention to something and decreased attention to everything else, that would be a way of describing trance. But to give you a very mundane example, we all go in and out of these kind of trance states all the time, every day. Even if we don't think we do, we do. And I don't do. I'm from an urban area, so I know everybody doesn't drive, but I know most people in the country drive. So I'm assuming you've driven a car, or at least been a passenger in
Mm-hmm.
a car. So most people who've driven a car are familiar with that road
Yeah.
trance, that driving, where especially if you're on the highway or it's at night, that center line coming at you, it's very rhythmic and monotonous, and it induces this trance-like state. So you can be driving the car honestly for like a full 5 minutes and be thinking about um, a conversation you had, or a meal you just ate, or the meal that you're going to eat. And you might even almost taste the food and your mouth might water. Or you might be, if you don't mind, I'll use your yoga example. You might have gotten in the car after the yoga
Mm-hmm.
encounter, yoga, and said, "Oh, I'm so angry. Why did she say that? What did she mean? And did I leave early? But you can be seeing and hearing and feeling the corresponding emotions quite vividly. Well, that's a trance state. That event is done and it's in the past, and it's probably different from how you're thinking about it now, right? Whatever transpired. But a part of you is still driving the car, but another part of you is very engrossed in this movie. That's an everyday trance. Same thing, I use this all the time, but people who like going to the movies and get really absorbed in the movie, I'm thinking like Harry Potter. You could watch Harry playing Quidditch and, he's almost fallen off, and now your heart's racing because you're like, oh no. And you're like, get back up there. And, maybe his team wins and you're exhilarated. And you forget that you're looking at a two-dimensional fabric screen populated by millions of dots, sitting in a leather seat next to total strangers. You really, if you're absorbed in a movie, that's a type of trance state. So it's a very common experience. Clinical hypnosis is really just more deliberately facilitating and changing or shaping a particular trance state.
Okay. So, what as a therapist, what are some of the techniques that you use? Oh, actually, before I ask that, there's something else I want to ask. Do we have a sort of a scientific understanding of what is happening inside the brain during, say, a hypnosis or a trance state like that?
So that's such a great question. There's actually been more and more research looking at functional magnetic resonance imaging and also self-reports by people undergoing hypnosis. And so what I heard at the conference I most recently attended, the presenter was somebody named Amir Raz, who's actually an expert in this area and does a lot of this research, is that we can tell if we know somebody's undergoing hypnosis, we can see changes in various areas of the brain. But if we were to just look at an MRI, it's not necessarily the case that we'd be able to say, absolutely, this person is undergoing hypnosis, because we still have more data to gather. But basically, for people who are highly hypnotizable, there's increased activity and increased connection between certain areas of the brain and decreased connection between other areas of the brain. And when somebody who is highly hypnotizable is undergoing hypnosis. And basically this facilitates this real absorption in what your brain deems is the important thing to focus on, but it helps you to kind of check out and stop paying attention to the other stuff that's not really relevant, including the self-consciousness. We're often very self-conscious when we are sitting with another person or being instructed to kind of go within, and the other person maybe isn't. I've had people say before a session, especially if it's their first time, that they're a little self-conscious about knowing that I'm alert and awake and observing them, and they may close their eyes and be focused on their inner world. And what they find is that when they get into trance, that kind of that concern about how they appear or what else they should be doing or other things on their to-do list actually it's like the volume is turned down on that function for the time being.
When people emerge from, say a trance state or being hypnotized, do they remember the experience?
So I always give people the suggestion to remember whatever is most relevant and helpful to them and leave behind everything else. And most people seem to do that pretty easily. If you're in a really light trance, you'll probably remember things very consciously as well. Sometimes people remember most of what I've said. Oftentimes people will not consciously remember the kind of midsection of the hypnosis because they get lost in the imagery that it generates. But then they'll remember my initial induction and then the instructions to come back. But the things that they do take away are, the things that feel most profound the insights that seem like the most important aha moments. And even unconsciously, I always give them the suggestion that over time, in the way that's right for them, in the right time frame, whatever that is, they'll find themselves more and more easily doing whatever it is that was the goal of the hypnotic session. So whether it's feeling more calm in the face of stressors, or noticing when they have the urge to bite their nails, that very immediately they instead have the urge to take a drink of water or take a deep breath, etc. So those things actually become very automatic, even if somebody's not consciously recalling or thinking about them at the time.
Hmm. How do you, as a therapist, determine, like, what criteria do you use to determine the depth of a hypnotic state somebody's going to go into?
So a lot of times I won't necessarily know until we do the session, but that's a great question. Most people, probably between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population, has some ability to go into trance. So, you know, they will, at minimum, be kind of daydreamy. And so that's something that I can reasonably expect most people will be able to do. But if I talk to them and I find out, that they tend to be people who get really absorbed in a book or a movie, they have a lot of driving trances, they're very creative, they're very receptive to and open to the idea of hypnosis, they often will have maybe an ability to go even a little bit deeper into a more moderate level trance. And then, this probably 10-15% of the population I'll find will be really hypnotically suggestible. They'll go really deeply into a state that looks like sleep and that might feel like sleep. But again, when I give them the suggestion to come back, they hear it and they come back. But you don't need to do that for there to be a benefit. And sometimes people's trances will be lighter than others, or deeper than others. It really depends.
So before I ask you about, like, the specific techniques you use, I'm curious to know as to whether or not there are similarities between the practices, that a therapist might use, and uh, like, say, a propagandist. I'm thinking of, like, Nazi propaganda. Because you look at this and you think this is like some kind of mass trance state. Are there techniques that people that are spewing propaganda use that are similar, like, to help people become more suggestive, that similar to what a hypnotherapist might use?
It's a really good question, and I want to answer that thoughtfully. Um, you know, so, in terms of the most common types of ways that people might use, um, I don't want to say hypnotic techniques, but, look, our minds are really receptive. Most people are somewhat suggestible. Some people are super suggestible. And all of these things also interact with our own desires and pre existing beliefs. So certain people will be more receptive to certain types of messages. And certain people tend to be less likely to challenge those messages. So there's a lot that probably goes into it. But that said, so I guess let me start with the techniques of hypnosis. So as I mentioned or alluded to before, your unconscious mind very much responds to symbol, imagery, metaphor, pacing, word choice, repetition. And there are other kind of techniques that help people get into a deeper hypnotic state and help their minds kind of form the images that you're trying to help them cultivate. And I always discuss with patients ahead of time very explicitly what it is their goals are and what images feel comfortable, and try and get to the right ones. I'm assuming in advertising, if you look at the imagery and the word choice and the way things are repeated, absolutely those things can probably have a hypnotic quality. If you're talking about politicians or people who are very persuasive, sure, there some people are probably very naturally hypnotic. Other people may have been coached or studied uh, techniques to try to make their speech more persuasive, without naming any current public figure. um, the repetitive hand gestures, the forceful language, the repeating of the same phrases over and over again, the very vivid and descriptive imagery, the catchy phrases. I think those things stick in people's psyches. And again, if they're really receptive to the tone of a specific message, or if it's in line with their already firmly held beliefs, and also if they tend not to be critical or do their own homework, um, I think someone who's trying to persuade people to their opinion will probably be more successful with those people. I'm concerned about um, people misusing techniques to um, persuade people to believe things that may not be true and may be harmful, that a specific subset of the population may not think to question. Um, but always bombarded with people, other people trying to persuade us to their point of view, and I mean that happens on a small scale too. In our personal lives and at work and in various social groups we belong to. Um, so it's really important to kind of know what you believe in and what you stand for and what kind of person you want to be, and look things up on your own. Um, you know, most people aren't going to be completely hypnotized against their will. It's just not really how it works. But we all are vulnerable to certain types of messages.
Yeah. Yeah, we are. I think my moment, I've talked about this before on this podcast, but I think my moment was probably my most important moment was when I realized that when I finally stopped drinking. And what I did was I constructed, as much as I hated what I was doing, I constructed this view of reality where the alternative was worse, which I'm sure is very common, so, oh my God, if I, if I stop, like if I stop drinking, I'm not going to be able to socialize with people. People only like the drunk version of Jason. It's just as asinine as that sounds to say it out loud right now. I mean, I really believed it. Or, if I admit that drinking is a problem, my wife is going to know that I was lying to her all those million times where I said it wasn't, and all of these different things. And so it's amazing how the fear kept me doing the very thing I wanted to stop doing, right? Because I constructed this world when the alternative was even worse than the thing I already hated. And then when I finally stopped, none of those things came true. And I was like, holy crap. What, I mean, what else, what other prison have I constructed, or prisons have I constructed for myself that I just can't see? It was an incredibly eye-opening experience for me to realize all that.
We all do that to some extent. And again, it's really to your credit that you were willing to take a look at something that's really hard to look at. And, um, you know, for all of us, it's worth stepping back and examining the evidence, both for the things we're trying to tell ourselves that maybe keep us from growing in the way we want to, but also for the things that we fear. Because a lot of times people's fears, if you actually sit down with them and say, oh, okay, well, so you're afraid people won't like sober Jason. And we were to talk about it, there's probably quite a bit of evidence to the contrary that you have been sober and people have responded very positively to you. And actually, that they've given you positive feedback. So when you examine the evidence for and against these beliefs that we hold so tightly and take as true, we often find that we can disconfirm them, or at least challenge them, or we at least have times when those things aren't true. And that can be a first step toward being less anxious and fearful about making change.
One last question I wanted to ask you, because I mean, I see this in myself a little bit. And as you, I mean, if you look at somebody like yourself, who's, done so much work in this field of understanding the human, psyche, and worked with a million people and all that kind of stuff. Do you ever, how does somebody with your level of knowledge seek counsel from somebody and still maintain an open mind? Because I feel like myself, sometimes what I do is I'll ask somebody for their opinion, but sometimes I feel like there's nothing you can offer me that I haven't already analyzed myself every which way from Sunday 50 million times. So how do you keep an open? I guess that my question is it challenging ever to keep an open mind about seeking the counsel of others for in an area you've already feel like you've attained mastery over? Do you know what I mean?
It's a really good question. And, there are definitely things where I might feel strongly about something, or I might feel that the evidence is really pointing in a particular direction. And like most people, I may not then seek out another opinion on that at the moment, unless there's some compelling reason. But for the most part, honestly, I feel like there's so much for me to learn. I learn something every day. I try to remind myself that even people I don't like or don't agree with or might be skeptical of can also teach me something. And so, I hope I always keep learning. Years ago, I knew a qigong master who definitely didn't present as a qigong master. Looked like a regular guy, but had studied very extensively in China and in the U.S. and elsewhere. And one thing one of his teachers had told him, and his teacher was, I think, some 80 something year old kung fu master, actually. And he said, nobody becomes a master before they're like 85 or like 100 years old. And it's important to remember that, because our egos always try to tell us that there's not as much for us to learn, and there's always more to learn. And it's hard to know what we don't know until we start being open and exploring. So I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah, me too, definitely. So, actually, one last question I wanted to ask you now that because this is one thing I've really been wondering about is why is conversation such a powerful tool for helping people make meaning out of things, concepts or ideas, or even it can be so powerful in just sorting out your own ideas. Like, I mean, you can have this idea in your head and it can like rumble around in there forever. And you say it out loud. And when you say it out loud and you hear it, you realize how dumb it sounds right away. So I guess, and I find for myself, like the more people I talk to, the more I learn. I feel like in conversation is where I really take what I've learned and make it into something more substantive, I guess. And I guess I just wanted to know your thoughts on why conversation is such a powerful tool to make meaning out of things.
Oh, that's such a great question. You've had a million great questions today, so you're doing exactly what you should be doing.
Oh, thanks.
Um, I think there's something really powerful about sharing what's bouncing around in our inner worlds with other people, and from realizing that other people also have struggles, they also have insights, they have interesting experiences. Conversation helps place us in a social context. It helps us know that we have support available to us. It helps us feel normal when we are feeling less normal. So I think there's so many things that it does for us. But social relationships are vital, and not everybody's equally social. But even if you're somebody who requires a lot of privacy, our connections, I agree with you. They give our lives meaning, and they help us feel love, and they help us feel loved and lovable. They help us feel compassion for ourselves and for other people. So then probably there's a lot more about why they help us make meaning. But I think we understand ourselves better in connection with other people as well.
Wonderful. Thanks. Well, hey, listen, this has been a great conversation for me. So I've learned a lot and really enjoyed it. And I'm sure the audience will want to know more about you and the work that you're doing. So I guess one thing is, are there any specific projects you have coming up that you'd like the audience to know about? And what would be the best way for them to find out more about the work that you're doing?
So I have a website. It's drtracistein.com, and it's Tracy with an I. And I'm on Twitter, and I have a professional Facebook page. I'm teaching at the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia. So once in a while I'll post about that. And I have my audio programs out on self hypnosis and meditation and guided imagery. And I do them because I really love doing them. I think that they're helpful for people. And so I hope people will check them out on iTunes.
Awesome. Well, we'll include the links to all of that stuff in the show notes page. And once again, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, Jason. Me too. Take care.
And how about that? Lots of knowledge drop. Not bleh. Let me try that again. I'm not going to edit that out because we want to keep it real here on Inquisitive Souls. How about that? Lots of knowledge bombs dropped, and your wonderful host, me, is slightly smarter than he was when that conversation started. So seek out every opportunity you can to create conversations with people. Inquisitive, generative, appreciative, empathetic, connecting conversations with people, because I'm telling you, it will change your world probably more than any other thing you can do. Not that I like to compare those things, but that's what apparently I'm doing. So I just recognize that our words create our worlds. And as I said at the beginning, we live in the worlds that our conversations create. So think about that and understand that the ability to create those conversations and connections with people, it's a skill. It can be learned. God, I used to be the guy that couldn't talk to anybody, in a group setting without getting shit-faced, or without being shit-faced and saying a bunch of dumb stuff and thinking I sounded smart. So, it's a skill and it can be learned. And I'm telling you, it can be learned by anybody. I'm living proof. So some words for you to ponder. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we will see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Emotionally Excellent Man Show. Now, go own your shit like the powerful, handsome boss man that you are.